I will be moderating this session. My name is Maria Fernanda Espinosa, member of NGIC, Executive Director of GWL Voices, and member of the Advisory Committee for COP29. It is really a pleasure to moderate this crucial discussion. We heard just now how much money we need for a low-carbon transition, where the money is going to come from, what are the mechanisms that are considered, what are the difficulties, the obstacles, but also the levers to overcome the challenges of a chronically underfinanced climate agenda. We also heard that we have to scale up from billions to trillions to finance the transition, in that the NCQG and COP29 are critical to ensure that we come up with the basic rules and numbers to ensure that the climate transition is financed and reaches the ones that suffer the most from the climate crisis. So the conversation that we are just about to have is not just about numbers and funding, it is about climate justice, about ensuring that those least responsible for climate change are not left alone to suffer its worst effect. We heard loud and clear from Hindu Amaru, from Patricia Espinosa, and the experts of the previous panel. Today, we will explore how we can catalyze the action and partnerships that are needed to rise to the historical challenge of the climate crisis, and perhaps more importantly, how to ensure a climate just and safe future for all. I have 5 very distinguished speakers. We have less than an hour for this panel. I would kindly ask the speakers to use maximum 5 minutes so we can have some time for interaction and dialogue after the panel. Allow me to start with Ivo Josipovic, President of Croatia from 2010 to 2015. I will then give the floor to Lord Alok Sharma, member of the House of Lords of the UK and COP26 President. I will then turn to Igor Luksic, former Prime Minister of Montenegro, followed by George Papandreou, Prime Minister of Greece between 2009 and 2011. To close, I haven't seen him around, with Judge Mohamed Abdelsalam, Secretary-General of the Zayed Award for Human Fraternity and Secretary-General of the Muslim Council of Elders and co-president of Religions for Peace. This is the order, 5 minutes per speaker. Let me now start with Ivo. Where is Ivo, actually?
Here.
Oh, okay, sorry, I couldn't see you. You know, my question to you is that, you know, as former president and an expert in international law, how do you view the role of international legal frameworks in holding nations accountable for their commitments to climate financing and the support for vulnerable countries and communities? And I'm asking this question because often COP decisions are, accused of being, written in paper and then not translated into action with very little accountability mechanisms. We heard that loud and clear from Hindu Amaru just a few minutes ago. So, President Josipovic, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Of course, our relations towards green transition and carbon neutrality depend on us whether is such transformation, big transformation, really necessary. From our daily experience and from statistical results, it's obvious that we need transformation. So how ensure it? And what is the role of law and justice in this process? Firstly, our planet must be kept and made secure for humanity. That means that we should do everything to fulfill our goal to perform green transformation. And the role of law and justice is very important. Firstly, measures on a very general level should be just. What does it mean? That means that, firstly, commitment should be very clear and honest. And secondly, that rich countries should have more burden to those processes because they really build their economies and their richness based on industries that are now responsible for our problems. So we should not prevent, of course, without any support our countries that are not so developed, undeveloped countries, and they should be reimbursed for taking measures that are slowing their development. Without that, I don't think that we would have an efficient system of measures. Secondly, we have to recognize that we have so many declarations, so many proclamations, but many countries, many individuals, many companies do not follow them. They not follow them because we don't want to get rid of our commodity, of our cars, cheap cars, our heating, cheap heating, and whatever. And of course, economy is not willing to get rid of very, very high profits based on carbon industry. Here I see important role of law and legal system. So, unlike in some areas like European Union, in European Union we have a relatively efficient system motivating states to obey measures by financial sanctions. On global level, we don't have anything. I don't know any efficient declaration or any efficient results of conferences in which the conclusions are followed by possible sanctions to those who are not fulfilling obligation. So I will be very short. I will propose something that is probably not realistic. It's some kind of utopia, but I'm not sure that in several years we will be not forced by the facts to involve this type of measures. Firstly, I think it's necessary to ensure efficient control of fulfilling of the international obligations for green transformation by states, by international companies, and by individuals as well. So we should have declarations or international conventions imposing sanctions for not obeying obligations. It's very important. So how to arrange this? Firstly, of course, we have to have appropriate international legislation based on UN decisions or multilateral decisions. Secondly, we have to establish some institutions, something like, not the same, of course, like International Criminal Court, or some controlling mechanism, independent controlling mechanism. And of course, we have some examples like European prosecutor. It's very important. It's independent, acting in some cases not in accordance with wishes of national states, but being very relatively efficient in protection of European interests. So on international level, I will repeat, we need efficient conventions envisaging sanctions. We need institutions how to fulfill this requirement. And of course, on national level, countries should apply measures or accept by international conventions to involve legislation and institutions to sanction those legal entities and natural persons for grave breaches of green transition legislation, let's call it like this. That means that laws should be efficient and sanctions must be very harsh. For companies who are breaking laws in that field, countries should impose really important sanctions. Also, even imprisonment should be imposed to those individuals who are performing grave breaches of those laws. So for me, now we have very good will expressed in many declarations, conventions, and so on, but mechanism is not efficient enough, it's not just enough, and we have to change it, we have to change the approach and to make international law more functional and more efficient than it is today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Josipovic. And you are so right, when we negotiate climate change agreements, we are negotiating our own lifestyles, and that's what makes it so difficult. I hear you say that perhaps to increase accountability and compliance and implementation, regional approaches to regulation could work with the example of the European Union. And I have to say that there is a very important ongoing process, which is the request of the General Assembly to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the role of governments as they comply with climate change provisions. So we are waiting still, for the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which I think would be an interesting development in international law. Let me now turn to Lord Alok Sharma, President of COP26, and as President of COP26, and with the expected outcomes of COP29 in mind, how can we bridge the gap between the pledges made and the actual financial commitments that we heard we sorely need, especially for the adaptation and resilience effort? We know that there is still a huge imbalance in the funding for adaptation and mitigation. So the floor is yours for five minutes, Lord Sharma.
Thank you so much, Maria. Well, you talk about COP26. During that period, I went to, I think, around 54 countries, many of them twice, some of them 3 times, some of them even 4 times, to try and push governments to do more. And of course, I met government ministers, I met business leaders, but for me, very importantly, I also met people on the front line of climate change. And I will never forget standing on the island of Barbuda, which many of you have been to, and literally a few years earlier that a hurricane had sort of blown in, Hurricane Irma. And this was a few years later, and sort of standing there in the middle of this island, it literally felt like a hurricane had just come in a few weeks earlier. The place was still devastated. And when I spoke to those who were still living on the island, because a lot of people had been displaced, they basically had 2 things to say. One is they were really fearful that these climatic events were becoming more frequent and more ferocious, and that was going to have an impact. And therefore, they needed countries to cut their emissions, particularly the biggest emitters. And the second thing they talked about was the fact that they needed the money to first adapt to the changing climate, but then also to support them to regrow their economies when they're hit by a hurricane and absolutely everything is wiped out. And so money both for adaptation but also mitigation. And so reflecting on this, I thought, well, basically they have set out the 3 pillars of the Paris Agreement on mitigation, on adaptation, and finance. And Maria, you talked about more money for adaptation. One of the things we did do at COP26 is get countries to agree to double the amount of adaptation finance. But we know there is a huge gap. So just talking about COP29, I think there are 2 things that we need to ensure happen. One is that we see the commitments to cut emissions, and the second is to increase the amount of money that is available. And I know there's a lot of work going on in terms of the new public finance goal that is supposed to be agreed at COP29 in Baku, and I wish that all the success. But we also know that whatever is agreed there, ultimately it is not going to be enough. It has got to be the private sector. And I think we've kind of got to the point where in terms of really getting private sector money to flow, and by the way, there is a big wall of money, right? In Glasgow, we have something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Mark Carney has been continuing to push that forward, $130 trillion of private sector assets committed to net zero. The problem is that it is not flowing at pace. And there are a number of things I think you can do. One of them, I think, is help developing countries with regulatory reform. So you can actually ensure the private sector can come and invest, make sure that you're embedding experts from the private sector, from other economies, to show how you can set up revenue mechanisms in developing nations. But by the way, that, in my view, has to be on the sort of the terms of developing countries. What we cannot have is a situation where any developing nation feels that the developed world, the business community, is coming in and telling them what to do. It has to be a real partnership. So I hope that's one thing that can come out of COP29. The second issue for me is on mitigation. So at COP26, we managed to get the world to agree that we would phase down coal. Patricia was there with us, helping at the time. Last year, there was an agreement on transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems. But I can also tell you, and I say this with all candidness, in the aftermath of COP26, there were countries that pushed back on what we had collectively agreed. And the same thing is happening now for COP28. They're pushing, COP29, they're pushing back on what was agreed at COP28. And I think the message that all of us need to give to the governments that we have contacts with is that, this is not a sort of pick and mixed menu that you agree internationally. I mean, everything has to be eaten. The whole menu has to be eaten. And I think that's a message that has to come out as well. And what we cannot have at this COP, as happens in many COPs, is those sort of, 1 minute to midnight discussions where negotiators are sort of gaming and trying to change things at the last minute. I mean, we're beyond that point. So, two things for me. One is the finance to flow. Secondly, to make sure that we actually get proper outcomes on mitigation. And the final point, of course, on fossil fuel subsidies. We have to recognize it's a transition. When I was in South Africa a few years ago, I met some miners. We talked about the Just Energy Transition Partnership of South Africa. But what they said to me was, we get it. We want a cleaner environment. But I've got to put food on the table tomorrow for my kids. And where are going to be the jobs in these new clean sectors? So I think we have to support developing countries with that as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lord Sharma, and you are so right. The only thing that we cannot afford right now is the pushback against the gains we have already achieved, that are not enough, and not that many, but, the phasing out coal commitment was a high point during your presidency, and transitioning away from fossil fuels. We cannot reopen, renegotiate, and go back because there is a, profound trust issue in between. Again, the need to scale up and fast-track private finance, I think it's also critical. We definitely need, private sector money, but here we hear, what are the obstacles, what are the challenges to make sure that the money really reaches where it needs to go. And on the mitigation front, yes, we do need a strong outcome in COP29, also on the mitigation front. And connected to zero tolerance for pushbacks, again, fossil fuel subsidies and the transitioning away from fossil fuels. I think this is a hard-won gain that we should keep in the agenda. So thank you very much for bringing your experience, first-hand experience to this panel. Let me now turn to Igor Luksic, Prime Minister of Montenegro, 2010-2012. As former Prime Minister, Igor, and Finance Minister, You have first-hand experience with the economic challenges of balancing national development and climate resilience. You know, what are the fiscal strategies? Lord Sharma mentioned, you know, the national challenges that some countries face. And I'm speaking from an oil exporting country experience, Ecuador. You know, more than 50% our income comes from oil export. What is, you know, the experience of your country and as not only Prime Minister, but also as Finance Minister of Montenegro? You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Maria Fernanda. Very interesting topic, which naturally flows out of the previous panel in which we discussed about the possibilities to figure out ways to provide with climate finance, adequate climate finance. But at the same time, we want to be aware of whether we are able to respond to the climate justice aspect of the whole story. And I'd like to take two ways of taking a look into this topic. One is probably more political, and I think we need to realize that this is unfortunately just another battleground, a global battleground, which probably in its challenges and controversies shares a lot of the same controversies which are related to geopolitics and everything else that we find elsewhere. So people are in principle interested to accept the notion of climate justice based on historical emissions, based on current distribution, based on the future responsibility. But somehow in all those negotiations, they also make sure that their position and their interests are well protected. So it is obviously not so easy to come to the eventual understanding of how it is to be dealt with and how all those pledged goals to be fulfilled. At the same time, or in parallel to that, I think it is quite interesting to look at another aspect of the climate justice. We are usually talking about, you know, public sector and providing money from the public sector. We realize that there is not enough funds, obviously, so we are discussing about how to bring in corporations and private sector and so on. And before going to what I'd like to make my major point on is this acceptance of the notion that there is not enough money in the public sector, which I strongly disagree with. And just like I think we discussed this on some previous occasion, I'd like to mention it here again. From my own country's experience, I'm pretty sure that had we been pursuing less populistic policies, there would have been more funds for not only climate goals, but SDGs. I'm pretty sure that I could easily identify at least 2% of GDP, which has been, of public spending, which has been very populistically, I should say, wasted, if we're talking about, you know, long-term prospects. And I'm pretty sure that in many other countries, including the least developed ones, the situation is the same. Because it is hard to ignore the fact that the less developed countries, their tax collection is less than 10% or 6–7%, which is not even enough for basic state functions. So sometimes more support should maybe be focused on providing or helping those countries expand their own capacities, rather than only being focused on whether this or that donor is able to solve this or that local problem of that particular village or that particular region or whatever, because I think we don't keep the bigger picture in mind enough. And actually, Addis Ababa Action Agenda talks a lot about that. But it is, I don't think it has been followed well. But this is my major point. You know, the major premise of dealing with environmental issues is polluters pay. Yeah? Polluters should be responsible to pay for those externalities. But if we take another view on the problem of climate justice, we figure out that it's actually individual emissions that we somehow don't keep on the screen enough. can you imagine that 1% of the world population is responsible for 14% of emissions, whereas 50% of the global population is responsible for 13% of emissions. So 50 of us emit more than 1,000 other people from who are less, who are poorer, obviously, because I kind of intuitively structured this group into higher income bracket. And that's interesting. If you take 10% of the population, it emits 45% of the individual emissions, based on the data assembled between 2010 and 2018. Very interesting. So how we respond to this? There are probably two options as far as, let's say, taxation is concerned. If we're thinking about whether that climate injustice can be turned into justice by addressing the same problem, by addressing that problem in a more or less same way, although taxation is always very controversial aspect and very much debatable. Is it carbon tax? We're talking a lot about carbon tax. But if carbon tax is levied on consumption goods, it's very regressive and hurts those less potent people. We're going to have carbon adjustment mechanism, I think, from the 1st of January in the EU, levied on some goods imported. And we'll see how it functions. If this carbon tax is, on the contrary, levied on wealth, on income, on capital gains, and so on, well, that's another story. So I think this principle of polluters pay should not only be about companies and solving externalities. It can also be, I think, turned a little bit around and applied to individual emissions. Because if we're talking about historical emissions, then it's probably logical to think about taxing inheritance. It's always controversial, but it's quite logical, because that inheritance has been fallen thanks to a lot of historical emissions that particular, let's say, family made over the course of the history. So I think that there are some aspects of this story which have not been really addressed fully. And there's a big space, I think, to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Luksic. And yes, I think there are many points that really make sense, and the issue of climate justice really has to look at past emissions and future responsibility as well. Even, domestically, thank you for reminding us, the huge gaps in the number of people and how much they emit individually. And this is part, of course, of the climate injustice that we're facing. And thank you for, pointing out the need for healthy enabling environments for private investment. I agree with you. The money is out there. The issue is what Lord Sharma mentioned, is the speed and the scale and the levers to make them happen, to make private investment happen, in the issue of domestic resource mobilization and a tax design that would accommodate countries individually. So thank you for that. Let me now turn to former Prime Minister of Greece, George Papandreou. And of course, the question to you would be that as former Prime Minister, you led Greece through a time of significant economic crisis. And what parallels do you see between the financial challenges you face as Prime Minister with a growing need for substantial investment in climate finance? You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to echo what Igor was saying. This is not a technical issue. We sometimes have technical discussions. Obviously, it's very linked to what research, what ideas and solutions. It's a highly geopolitical, political, ideological issue. There are interests that are fighting it. There are interests that don't want to change things. There are interests that have vested resources and so on that would not like to see this transition. And the inequalities that exist are very strong. We have, some have even called it a climate apartheid, where within our societies you have the poor more impacted and the rich being able to avoid, at least for a period of time until the planet burns, avoid the climate crisis or the results or the ramifications of the climate crisis, and between countries, of course. I think Joyce yesterday mentioned how Africa only is emitting 3%, but it's paying highest or one of the highest costs in the world because of this. This is a problem between nations, within nations, but it also is, as mentioned earlier, both by Igor but others, a private issue. There's a lot of money. Oxfam, I don't know, Igor, about your statistics, but I was with the head of Oxfam yesterday, and she mentioned that 1% of the richest in the world pollute more than 2/3 of the global population. And of course, there are other disparities too, gender, we mentioned, and so on. The Summit for the Future recognizes some of these disparities, 100 billion a year, if it ever materializes, hopefully. But I would like to make some suggestions, and again, Igor mentioned taxes. Some years ago, I set up a commission for the Copenhagen COP, and the head of the commission was Göran Persson from Sweden and Ricardo Lagos from Chile. They went to all 5 continents, discussed and came up with a proposal which we did table then. Copenhagen was not a very successful COP. Basically, it's a simple solution, politically very difficult, but a simple solution. Tax carbon, tax CO2. Or I would say all polluting gases. That money, at least the most of it, would be put into a global fund. And that global fund would be then managed. Would it be the UN? Would it be the World Bank? Would it be the development banks together around the world? And that money, so it would not burden the less developed and the developing countries, that money would mostly go to these countries to be able to build their infrastructure for a transition to a green and sustainable development. Rather than having subsidies, 7 trillion in subsidies, let's talk about taxes. So I think that is one possibility. But there's another political side, what I think is we sometimes, it's difficult to see, but not that we don't always talk about it, because we talk about the technical issues and sometimes the bureaucratic issues and sometimes how we set up funds and so on. France, Macron put a tax on petrol. A very good idea. But he did not deliberate with his citizens, and it hit the poorest of France, and you had the whole Gilets jaunes movement. What was his reaction at some point, which helped mitigate this political problem, was he set up a citizens' assembly. Actually, Laurence Toubiana, who had negotiated in 2015 the Paris Agreement, was head of this discussion. They came up with very good and interesting solutions. Were they all accepted? That's a big controversy and so on. Anyway, what I think was important here is that we need to deliberate with our society on the measures and the ways that we will have this transition. Bring the citizens in. And that's why I want to mention 3 elements I think are important in this. First of all, okay, time.
Can you wrap up, Prime Minister, please?
Okay, I will then. Okay, 3 elements. Social justice, absolutely important. Democratic transition, we need citizens to own the process. And I would even say we can, with the technology, own the power, empower. Power to the people can exist. We can use solar panels and houses and schools and public buildings and communities. They should be part of it. And thirdly, the culture, the education is going to be a huge transformation if we want to have this happen. I just want to close by saying that I just happened to become a president of an organization called Circle the Med. It's about the Mediterranean. It's an organization which has stakeholders in the Mediterranean, a lot about Europe and Africa, how we are going to work together. So I would like to see how we could work with Nizami Ganjavi Center coming up to the COP, maybe some pre-COP meetings, some Zooms, and see how we can make in our region of the Mediterranean, should be, environment and climate should be an area where we can come together in an area with many conflicts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and thank you for your 3 last points. Yes, it's not a matter of the arithmetics of money, because there is money out there, for your excellent points on the need for enabling environment, social justice, a democratic transition where citizens buy in the hard decisions that need to be taken domestically, with the example of the Gilets jaunes in France, and a education and a culture of a low-carbon education and culture, as I understood. Thank you very much for your great contributions to this dialogue. I will close the panel with our last speaker. I'm told that we are really running behind now, so I am honored to give the floor to Judge Mohamed Abdelsalam, Secretary-General of the Zayed Award for Human Fraternity. You have the floor, and of course, as we expect, you will be sharing your thoughts on what is the role of faith-based organizations to contribute to climate action. I understand you are speaking in Arabic, and that we will be seeing your remarks translated into English in the screen. You have the floor.
Thank you very much,
for 5
Maria.
minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to, in the beginning, to thank the organizers team for this important event, and which comes at a critical time. Many challenges facing humanity today, and as Maria said, I would like to deliver my speech in Arabic. Translation is on the screen, and I think it's also amazing opportunity to enjoy our Arabic language. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسعدني أن أشارك في هذه الجلسة المهمة ضمن الاجتماع رفيع المستوى الذي ينعقد بالموازاة مع الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة حول مفاهيم هي الأجدر بالنقاش في ظل السياق العالمي الحالي وما يفرضه من تحديات. بالطبع العدالة والمساواة هما اليوم مفتاحين للاستجابة فعالة لأزمة المناخ، وما تفرضه من عمل مناخي أنفع وأكبر وقعاً يضاف إلى الأهمية البالغة للإشكاليات التي يناقشها هذا الاجتماع المهم، حيث يربط بين حدثين هما الأهم في العالم: قمة الأمم المتحدة للمستقبل، والتي نأمل أن تأتي لنا ببوادر أمل على الأقل لمستقبل أفضل، ومؤتمر الأطراف 29 المزمع انعقاده في أذربيجان في نوفمبر المقبل. لقد أصبح من الواضح أن العبء يقع بشكل غير متناسب على سكان الأرض الأكثر ضعفاً، رغم أنهم الأقل إسهاماً في المشكلة المناخية، فضلاً عن أن الافتقار إلى قوة صوت هؤلاء والتمثيل المناسب لهم في عمليات اتخاذ القرار يؤدي لا شك إلى سياسات لا تراعي حاجات وأولويات هذه المجتمعات الضعيفة، ما يجلي أزمة العدالة والمساواة. لا شك أن التعاليم الدينية يمكن أن تلهم الناس للعمل من أجل تحقيق قيم العدالة والتضامن، وتعزز المرونة، وتخلق مسارات للحلول العادلة في مواجهة الأزمات العالمية المشتركة. وبينما ننغمس في سلسلة الحوارات المهمة هذه، أتذكر معكم بعض الكلمات لفضيلة الإمام الأكبر الشيخ الدكتور أحمد الطيب شيخ الأزهر الشريف رئيس مجلس حكماء المسلمين، عندما قال أن تغير المناخ يشكل تحدياً عالمياً يتطلب استجابة عالمية تقوم على العدل والمساواة والتضامن. هذه الروح فعلاً هي ما نحتاج إليه اليوم لتعزيز التزاماتنا بصياغة مستقبل أكثر عدلاً واستدامة للجميع. وكما ذكر قداسة البابا فرانسيس في رسالته العامة لاداتو سي، نحن لا نواجه أزمتين منفصلتين، واحدة بيئية والأخرى اجتماعية، بل هي أزمة معقدة واحدة اجتماعية وبيئية. بالفعل أزمة التغير المناخي يجب أن تشكل المسؤولية الأخلاقية الأولى لدينا كمؤسسات وهيئات دولية، فمهما كانت القضايا التي تعني بها مؤسساتنا، فإن إشكالية المناخ يجب أن تشكل الأولوية في كافة استراتيجياتنا وبرامجنا، لأن كل القضايا اجتماعية، اقتصادية، ثقافية ترتبط ارتباطاً وثيقاً بالمناخ، التي هي مسألة استمرار وجود نوعنا البشري وأنواع أخرى كثيرة من الكائنات الحية على كوكب الأرض. والفشل في معالجة أزمة المناخ يهدد بآثار من شأنها أن تقوض أسس الحضارة الإنسانية كاملة ومظهرا صارخا من مظاهر الظلم بين الأجيال. واسمحوا لي بهذه المناسبة أن أذكر بعض من جهود ومبادرات مؤسسة مجلس حكماء المسلمين في هذا السياق، حيث ولله الحمد وكما أشاد بذلك المؤسسات الأممية وفي مقدمتها الأمم المتحدة والاتحاد الأوروبي والعديد من الصحف العالمية، قدم مجلس حكماء المسلمين العام الماضي القمة العالمية لقادة ورموز الأديان في أبو ظبي يوم 6 نوفمبر، حيث صدر نداء الضمير، هذا البيان الذي وقع عليه 30 من قادة ورموز الأديان من حول العالم يمثلون معظم سكان الأرض، وفي مقدمتهم الإمام الأكبر شيخ الأزهر والبابا فرانسيس بابا الكنيسة الكاثوليكية. وهذا البيان دعا صناع القرارات والسياسات من حول العالم إلى اتخاذ إجراءات فعالة وملموسة حقيقية تواجه أزمة تغير المناخ. في كوب 28 من العام الماضي لأول مرة في تاريخ الكوب وفي تاريخ مؤتمر الأطراف كان هناك جناح للإيمان داخل الكوب، وتم تدشين هذا الجناح الذي وفر منصة عالمية لتلاقح الأفكار ورؤية القيادات حول مواجهة هذا التحدي الخطير. لقد كان شهادة قوية على قدرة المجتمعات الدينية والروحية المتنوعة على الاتحاد حول القيم المشتركة للرعاية البيئية والرحمة والعدالة، وشهدنا بشكل مباشر قدرة الإيمان على تجاوز الحدود والثقافات والإيديولوجيات وإلهام الناس لاتخاذ إجراءات معتبرة للتصدي لأزمة المناخ. في كوب 29 إن شاء الله نتوقع أن تحتضن أذربيجان في يوم 5 و6 نوفمبر قمة عالمية لرموز الأديان تحت رعاية الرئيس إلهام علييف، وأنتهز هذه الفرصة لأقدم له كل الشكر والتقدير على دعمه الكبير لهذه القمة. وأيضا سوف يكون لدينا للنسخة الثانية من جناح الأديان في كوب 29 في المنطقة الزرقاء إن شاء الله، ليمثل منصة جديدة لتلاقح الأفكار وتلاقي الرؤى حول إشراك صوت الدين في مواجهة هذه الظاهرة الكارثية التي تهدد مجتمعاتنا. تلك هي رسالتنا المشتركة ومهمتنا الجماعية التي ينبغي أن نتضامن جميعا من أجلها. وفي الختام أود أن أشكر مؤسسة نظامي كنجافي على تنظيم هذا الحدث، وأشكركم جميعا على هذه الأفكار الممتازة التي سمعناها. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله. شكرا. Thank you.
Shukran, Judge Abdelsalam. I think that you place the spiritual and ethical responsibility that we have to curb the climate crisis that we are experiencing. Of course, faith-based organizations have a critical role to play, and as you very well put it, in environmental stewardship, compassion, and justice for all. It's very good news that for the second time you will have a faith pavilion at COP29 and continue the good work. Thank you very much to the outstanding stellar speakers of the panel. I am told that very unfortunately we don't have time for questions from the audience, and that we will just transit immediately to the next panel. So thank you again to all the speakers.